Picture two nuclear giants locked in a maritime standoff where a single wrong move could trigger the conflict that ends the world as we understand it. The waters of the South China Sea represent humanity's most volatile pressure point right now, a ticking time bomb where any error in judgment might spark a war that rewrites the entire architecture of international power. That moment when Beijing's military confronted an American destroyer wasn't simply another tactical encounter. It exposed something much more profound: America's dying grip on global supremacy and the emergence of a balanced, multipolar international order that our leaders in Washington desperately refuse to acknowledge. Here's the narrative the corporate press refuses to share with you. This confrontation exposes the core bankruptcy of how America conducts itself abroad. We're clinging to outdated Cold War assumptions in an era that has completely moved past them, labeling China as an adversary requiring encirclement instead of recognizing it as an ancient society deserving genuine respect, the uncomfortable reality. We're hemorrhaging more than $800 billion every year on weapons and soldiers, keeping military installations across 80 nations while our bridges collapse and working families can barely survive. This standoff in international waters isn't really about protecting maritime freedoms. It's about preserving an imperial system that's destroying us spiritually and financially. The question that actually matters isn't which country prevailed in this encounter. It is whether the United States can evolve from an overbearing empire into a genuine partner willing to collaborate before we run out of time completely. Allow me to say something that will probably disturb certain audiences, but honesty demands it be voiced. Whenever we discuss Beijing challenging American naval power, we must confront a basic reality check. What precisely was that US destroyer doing prowling the South China Sea to begin with? Consider this thought experiment for just a moment. What if Chinese warships conducted their own freedom of navigation patrols 50 miles from San Diego or cruised regularly near Miami Beach? How would our government respond? How would American citizens react to that scenario? We'd immediately label it aggression, provocation, and existential threat to everything we hold dear. But somehow, when our destroyers navigate waters 7,000 miles from American shores, directly adjacent to China's coastal regions, we brand it as upholding international norms and preserving the global order. This blatant double standard isn't merely hypocritical. It's reckless, and it is dragging us toward a confrontation that benefits absolutely nobody except the defense contractors profiting from endless escalation. The incident under discussion today didn't materialize out of nowhere. It represents one piece of a calculated strategy launched decades earlier, grounded in a catastrophically flawed premise about our post-Cold War reality. When the Soviet Empire crumbled in 1991, American strategists persuaded themselves that history itself had concluded that liberal democracy combined with American brand capitalism had triumphed permanently, and that the United States possessed both the right and responsibility to remake the entire planet according to our vision. This wasn't mere arrogance. It was a catastrophic misunderstanding of history, civilization, and the diversity of human societies. China, possessing 5,000 unbroken years of sophisticated civilization, was never destined to simply embrace Western governance models and submit to American-directed global management. The Chinese people haven't forgotten their century of national humiliation when Western colonial powers alongside Japan systematically dismembered their nation, forced degrading treaties upon them, and treated Chinese sovereignty like it was meaningless. They remember the Opium Wars vividly, when the British Empire literally waged war to compel China to accept narcotic imports that were systematically poisoning Chinese society. These aren't dusty ancient tales. This is their lived collective memory that fundamentally shapes how Chinese strategists think today. Now let's examine what actually transpired when China confronted that American warship and what the genuine consequences have been. The media-industrial complex loves packaging these incidents into simplistic narratives. Beijing acted belligerently, Washington stood its ground, China retreated or suffered consequences. But the actual situation is infinitely more layered and considerably more disturbing. Every single one of these naval close calls escalates the probability of catastrophic miscalculation, of some accident spiraling into something neither government actually wanted. We're engaged in a suicidal game of chicken involving nuclear-armed superpowers, and the officials orchestrating these decisions appear to have forgotten that in contemporary warfare nobody wins, only varying degrees of apocalyptic devastation exist. The supposed price Beijing paid might involve some diplomatic condemnation or heightened international criticism. But what cost are we actually bearing? We're sacrificing our moral authority, our relationships throughout the Asian continent, the confidence of nations increasingly exhausted by being pressured to pick sides between Washington and Beijing. I've dedicated my entire professional life to examining international development and the global economy, and I can state with complete confidence that the Asia-Pacific region categorically rejects a renewed Cold War. Nations including Vietnam, the Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, South Korea, and Japan all want robust trade with China, productive cooperation with Beijing, while simultaneously maintaining positive ties with America. They refuse to become expendable pieces in great power chess games, when we compel them into binary choices, when we demand they join military coalitions designed to encircle China. We aren't enhancing our strategic position, we're actively undermining it. We are demanding these countries sacrifice their economic prosperity and regional peace for the sake of American strategic ambitions that most of them fundamentally disagree with. Examine the economic fundamentals here carefully. China serves as the primary trading partner for virtually every Asian nation. It's not remotely close. American commerce matters, certainly, but it cannot compete with the sheer volume and deep integration of Chinese economic partnerships across the region. So when we insist these countries must align against Beijing, we're requesting they act directly against their own economic welfare, and that approach cannot succeed long-term. The more profound problem here is that American foreign policy has become completely severed from actual American domestic priorities. We're expending astronomical resources maintaining military dominance throughout the Pacific, executing freedom of navigation operations that antagonize China, and constructing new military partnerships like AUKUS, all while our own nation literally disintegrates. Have you experienced American infrastructure recently? Have you witnessed the condition of our bridges, water treatment facilities, mass transit systems? We have metropolitan areas where kids drink lead-poisoned water, where public schools are physically crumbling, where homelessness has reached crisis proportions. We have 40 million Americans trapped in poverty, student loan debt crushing entire generations, healthcare expenses bankrupting working families, and an opioid catastrophe that has killed more Americans than every foreign war we've fought combined. And yet supposedly the priority remains asserting military dominance in the South China Sea. This transcends being merely wrong. It's genuinely insane. It represents a complete betrayal of ordinary Americans, a massive squandering of resources that future historians will regard with absolute bewilderment. Let me highlight something rarely mentioned in these discussions about naval confrontations and military posturing. China's ascent isn't fundamentally a military narrative, it's an economic and technological transformation story. While we've been pouring trillions into wars across Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and maintaining hundreds of military installations globally, China has invested relentlessly in infrastructure, education, advanced technology, and systematic economic development. They've constructed the planet's most extensive high-speed rail system, connecting their vast country and dramatically enhancing both productivity and living standards. They've committed massively to sustainable energy, becoming the unquestioned global leader in solar manufacturing and electric vehicle technology. They've elevated 800 million human beings out of desperate poverty within a single generation, the most extraordinary achievement in human development history. Meanwhile, what have we actually accomplished with our military expenditures? What tangible benefits do we possess from the $7 trillion spent on post-9/11 wars? We have complete chaos throughout the Middle East, strengthened Iranian regional power, refugee crises that destabilized Europe, and absolutely nothing that genuinely enhanced American security or prosperity. The core flaw in our China strategy is that it stems from fear instead of wisdom, from military reflex rather than diplomatic imagination. We observe China's Belt and Road Initiative investing in infrastructure projects spanning Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and our response involves increasing our military footprint and attempting military containment of China. This logic is completely backwards. If we're genuinely concerned about Chinese global influence, the solution isn't additional warships. It's superior economic alternatives, more compelling development partnerships, authentic respect for national sovereignty instead of conditional assistance packages loaded with political requirements attached. Countries participate in China's Belt and Road Initiative not because they're being threatened, but because they desperately require infrastructure investment, and Beijing offers financing terms that Western institutions simply won't provide. If we want to compete effectively with that approach, we need to offer something demonstrably better, not threaten military consequences for nations that accept Chinese capital. There's also a crucial moral dimension to this conversation that demands honest confrontation. The United States has branded itself the guardian of international law and defender of the rules-based global system. Yet we've violated international law repeatedly whenever it conflicted with our perceived interests. We invaded Iraq without United Nations Security Council authorization. We've executed drone assassination programs killing civilians across numerous countries without their consent. We've imposed unilateral economic sanctions causing humanitarian catastrophe. We've orchestrated coups against legitimately elected governments. We abandoned the Iran nuclear agreement, the Paris Climate Accord, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty. We have refused to join the International Criminal Court and actually passed domestic legislation threatening to militarily invade The Hague if American officials face prosecution for war crimes. So when we lecture Beijing about honoring international standards and respecting the rules-based order, much of the planet perceives this as staggering hypocrisy. This doesn't justify Chinese violations of international law, but it completely demolishes our credibility as the enforcer of those very standards. What unfolded in that naval confrontation represents a microcosm of a far larger tragedy playing out before our eyes. We are witnessing the potential collapse of the single most important bilateral relationship on Earth, the relationship between the United States and China. These two nations collectively account for 40% of planetary GDP, 40% of global military expenditure, and whether we successfully address climate change, pandemic threats, nuclear weapons proliferation, and international economic stability depends entirely on whether Washington and Beijing can find ways to cooperate, or whether they'll spend the next half-century locked in mutually destructive competition. The stakes could not possibly be higher, yet our current policy framework seems specifically engineered to guarantee conflict rather than prevent it. We're not pursuing diplomatic engagement with the same intensity we're pursuing military encirclement. We're not investing in genuinely understanding Chinese perspectives, Chinese historical experiences, China's legitimate security interests. Instead, we're constructing new military alliances, accelerating weapons transfers to Taiwan, conducting increasingly provocative military exercises, and then expressing shock when Beijing responds in ways we characterize as aggressive. I want absolute clarity on something because this is precisely where nuance disappears in our toxic polarized discourse. Criticizing American foreign policy toward China absolutely does not mean endorsing everything China does domestically or internationally. China's treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang is morally abhorrent and demands sustained international scrutiny. The systematic dismantling of democracy in Hong Kong violated both the letter and spirit of the one country, two systems framework. Chinese cyber espionage operations and systematic intellectual property theft represent serious challenges requiring concrete responses. But here is the absolutely crucial point that changes everything. None of these legitimate issues will be resolved through military confrontation. None of them justify gambling on a war that could devastate both nations and potentially the entire human civilization. The pathway to addressing these valid concerns runs through sustained diplomatic engagement, through constructing coalitions with other nations sharing our concerns, through economic incentives and penalties that are genuinely multilateral rather than unilateral American dictates, through supporting grassroots civil society rather than military escalation. The fundamental truth that nobody in Washingtonese power structure wants to publicly acknowledge is that the era of unchallenged American dominance has permanently ended, and that transformation isn't necessarily catastrophic. A multipolar international system where power gets distributed among multiple centers instead of concentrated in one superpower could actually prove more stable and more equitable if we navigate the transition intelligently. But navigating it intelligently demands accepting present reality rather than attempting to freeze history at 1991, when we stood as the world's sole superpower. It requires acknowledging that China's rise, India's emergence, the reassertion of regional powers across the globe represents a natural and historically inevitable process reflecting economic development and long-term historical patterns reasserting themselves after the temporary aberration of Western colonial supremacy. Our choice isn't whether to prevent this transformation. We cannot stop it. Our actual choice is whether to adapt gracefully to this new reality, constructing a cooperative international architecture where we remain an essential major player but not the exclusive decision maker, or whether to resist militarily, economically, and diplomatically until we completely exhaust ourselves in futile confrontation. If you found this perspective valuable and want to see more honest analysis that challenges the mainstream narrative, please hit that like button and support Global Minds Explained by Jeffrey Sachs. Which path do you believe America should choose, partnership or domination?